right at 11:10. So we're going to start, and a couple of announcements to begin with. First of all, I know you're all eager to know the result of the poll of how many of you watched the wedding of William and Kate, the royal wedding of William and Kate this summer. Did you get to see the result? No? So you are really eagerly awaiting the result. What you'll know is that you vote a little more often than most of the American public. The turnout rate was about 60%. And 62% had better things to do, not surprisingly. 35% didn't. And a miraculous 2% couldn't remember whether they'd watched it or not. So whoever that person was clearly had the best summer of all. I want to... Where's Gavin? Who's Gavin? Gavin, excellent series of choices on the chat room for music suggestions for today, one of which you'll see I've taken up. So the first prize goes to Gavin. And then the last announcement I have is we are in a period of adjustment in terms of enrollment. And we're particularly looking for people who would like to switch in to the 4 to 5 o'clock section on a Wednesday. Now, I know that all of you understand the advantages of having a section late in the afternoon on Wednesday. It sets you up perfectly for a fun evening of studying in the library and other good stuff. So we urge anyone, if anyone wants to volunteer to get into that section, please come and see me afterwards, and I'll try and think of a suitable prize. Okay, as promised on last week, I was going to play you music every time you come into the room, and the outline of the lecture you see before you. So as you can see, this lecture is not a version of Four Weddings and a Funeral, although there'll be bits of it will come into the lecture. I'm clearly not Hugh Grant, far better looking than that. And this lecture will not be a romantic comedy with a happy ending, although it might. You know, we'll wait and see how it goes. What I want to do in this lecture is basically contrast 2 years, 1981 and 2011. Both years marked by a really significant global economic and political crisis, I'm going to suggest. And that crisis was felt in many, many parts of the world in both of these years. And yet, it has nationally very specific manifestations and characters. Okay? And in Britain, the way in which I'm going to try and get at that nationally specific nature of the crisis is by contrasting these two different types of events, royal weddings and riots, both of which happen to occur in this year. And I'm going to be asking, basically, in this lecture, what are the similarities and differences between not a royal wedding and a riot, but between the events of both of those years. So let's start with the introduction. 1981 marked the arrival of a new type of economic liberalism, a new type of political economy upon Europe and the US. And it took the form of two administrations, Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, elected in 1979, and of course our own Ronald Reagan, elected in 1981. Both of those administrations, both in very important budgets in the year of 1981, overturned the Keynesian principles of economic management that had basically existed since the 1940s. And they believed that essentially that the government had to withdraw from managing the economy because only free markets could generate prosperity. They believed that public services had to be subjected to the disciplines of the market to become efficient, and they believed that the market would instill a new type of responsibility into individuals who had been led morally astray by their dependence upon a welfare culture. Now, to achieve these principles, they introduced budgets that substantially reduced government expenditure, primarily by cutting public services and by reducing taxes. In the US case, in the UK, what they did basically was shift the burden increasingly from direct income tax to sales taxes. Now, this reinvention of markets as the structuring principle of government and social life has often been referred to as something called neoliberalism. Okay, neoliberalism. Intellectually, neoliberalism can be traced back to the work of Hayek in the 1940s. It can be traced to the economic programs that developed in the 1970s, particularly around the World Bank and the IMF through their structural adjustment programs. And politically, it can be associated with the regimes of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. So it's a very diverse and protein beast that takes quite different types of forms and has a quite complex history. So I'm necessarily having to do some level of reduction here. Now, I would suggest that we are now currently still living in the thrall of this new ideology that emerged in 1981. And I would suggest that much of the world, not just the US and the UK, are living under its thrall. Government is now done by markets rather than governments trying to govern markets in the name of society or social equity. And as I suggest, even though this is a global phenomenon, it has nationally specific forms. And in Britain, what I want to do today is show the way in which neoliberalism paradoxically depended upon a reanimation of certain archaic social forms. Okay? So this very new thing depended upon re-energizing, breathing new life into social phenomena that appear to be very traditional and archaic. And they are, of course, the institution of the royal family. Very hard to think of a more archaic institution. And the phenomena of rioting. So, and this is the point that I want you to get for the class as a whole. This is not just about the survival of tradition. Okay? Britain has a lot of traditions. Okay? They aren't simply remnants of the past. They are continually reworked, reinvented, rethought. And this is what I'm going to try and show you today with the example of the royal family and the riots. And of course, the ultimate paradox here is that neoliberalism promoting a market culture is also producing these two things, a royal family and rioting, that seems utterly opposed to market principles. Okay? And yet I'm going to suggest it's sort of structurally dependent upon them. Oops. Okay, so we're going to move into the first section of the lecture now and talk about the wedding of Charles and Diana. But before we get there, I want to give you a little bit of backstory, a little bit of history. And I'm doing that in order to make the point that the monarchy isn't just an ancient institution. It's one that is constantly reinvented and constantly doing new types of cultural work in every generation. So let me take you back to the heady year of 1953 and the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. This was a hugely important moment for the British royal family, because the royal family was arguably at its most unpopular in the late 1930s. And it was unpopular primarily because of the abdication crisis caused by Edward VIII's determination to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. Okay? There was no way that the head, the royal family, the monarch in Britain is the head of the Anglican Church, the established religion in Britain. There's no separation of state and church in the UK. There was no way that a monarch could marry someone who had already been divorced, let alone in America. So he abdicates. The institution is in a good deal of in a new sort of nadir of unpopularity. You've all seen, no doubt, the film The King's Speech, yeah, which is about the beginning of the recuperation of the institution. But it's really the coronation in 1953 that does it, and it does it because you have to remember that in 1953 Britain is still basically a bomb site. Okay, it's a bomb site where rationing is still in place for many key commodities. The country basically is still trying to recover from the mayhem of the Second World War. There's declining attendance in churches, which many people think signal a type of crisis in the Anglican Church. There is, of course, the beginning of the unraveling of the British Empire, and the monarch is the head of the empire. 1947 is the iconic date of the independence for India and Pakistan. So a lot is loaded into Queen Elizabeth II being able to reinvent and re-energize the institution of the monarchy and to present a new picture of the perfect happy family that you see before you. It's also the first big royal event to be televised. Okay, 20 million people reputedly watch it on TV. Many people buy their televisions for the first time in order to watch the thing. And as a consequence, it has a type of global coverage that no other royal event has previously had. And yet, this new family romance of Queen Elizabeth II quickly turns sour. Quickly they discover that indeed this isn't necessarily the happiest of family. And more importantly, it's a family that has now become locked into a relation of dependence upon the media to project its image, and the media is increasingly scrutinizing the dynamics of this happy family and found, like most happy families, there's quite a lot of stuff going on that it's not generating necessarily total happiness. This culminates in a 1969 documentary which really reveals the ways in which Philip especially, this is very late to arrive into the class, how Charles especially has a very estranged relationship with his father Philip, who has a very authoritarian style of parenting. This is 1969. Authoritarian styles of parenting are beginning to go out of fashion. Fast forward to 1977,